11 years ago, Callum Reed lost his wife, his best friend, and the design that could have changed aviation safety forever, all in a single night. He walked out of Seattle with a suitcase, a toolbox, and an 8-year-old girl who didn't understand why they had to leave. He swore he would never return. But on a Monday morning, Celeste Hollis and Grant Hollis stepped into a boardroom expecting to meet the mysterious billionaire who had just purchased their failing company. When the door opened and Callum walked through in a black suit, he set a wedding ring on the table and said, "We begin with the truth. If you believe betrayal can never bury the truth forever, stay with this story all the way to the end." The night it all collapsed began without drama and ended before Callum Reed had time to fully understand the geometry of what he was losing. He returned home early from the test site because the Sentinel Loop trial had been postponed without explanation. A cancellation that landed in his inbox with a flatness that felt wrong even before he reached the freeway. His truck turned onto their street in the kind of late autumn dusk that makes Seattle look like a watercolor left in the rain. And the first thing he registered was Grant Hollis's silver sedan sitting in the driveway with the ease of something that belonged there. Callum walked through the front door without announcing himself, followed the light from the kitchen into the living room, and found 2 half-finished glasses of wine on the coffee table and Grant's watch, the brushed titanium one Callum himself had given him, resting on the arm of the couch as though set down rather than forgotten. A moment later, Celeste came down the stairs in a state of calibrated panic, her expression caught between surprise and the blankness of someone still composing a lie they hadn't finished writing. Callum did not raise his voice or move toward either of them with anything that could be read as threat. He asked how long, looking at Celeste rather than Grant, because Grant's answer was going to be whatever version was most useful to Grant. Grant appeared from the hallway behind her, shoulders squared, voice already shifting into the register he used for talking investors past their doubts, and he told Callum the situation was not what it appeared, and then, almost in the same breath, suggested that if Callum had been present in his own home more than 2 evenings a week, none of this would have been necessary. Celeste opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the floor, and the silence that followed was longer and more complete than any answer she might have given, and Callum understood in the course of it that the duration of the affair was something both of them had decided he should not know. He asked the question a second time, received the same silence, and allowed it to stand as the confession it was, because demanding a number would have changed nothing that needed to be changed. Grant attempted twice more to reframe the conversation as a failure shared between all parties. But Callum was no longer listening in the way that produces argument. He was listening in the way that produces clarity, and the clarity produced a stillness that unsettled Grant far more than anger would have. The house held all 3 of them for another 20 minutes before Grant left, and then Celeste, and then Callum sat in the dark for a long time without the lights on. At 11 that night, a formal notification arrived from the board of directors informing him that a review had been opened into the Sentinel Loop test failure, citing a modification to the flight control code that bore his digital signature and a timestamp, placing the change in a window when he had been in a hotel in Portland, waiting for weather clearance. He read the document 3 times because it described an action he had not taken, named him as sole responsible party for a decision he had not made, and identified Grant as the colleague who had flagged the discrepancy in good faith. A contrast so deliberately constructed that the document functioned less as an investigation notice and more as a finished verdict. During the weeks that followed, as the legal process sorted the company into its new configuration with a speed suggesting the configuration had been decided before any process was officially opened. Callum's attorney discovered that Sentinel Loop's ownership had already been transferred to the newly restructured Aurelian Aviation through documents bearing Celeste's signature and dated 3 months before the test failure. She received equity in the new entity, Grant became chief executive, and the settlement presented to Callum amounted to a well-prepared offer to be paid a modest sum to go away without litigation. In the custody proceedings that followed, Celeste stated that her executive schedule made consistent parenting impractical, which gave Callum primary custody of Wren without contest. The only outcome of that entire season that felt like something other than a wound. He packed a single suitcase, a metal toolbox, and Wren's drawings into the bed of his truck, buckled his daughter into the passenger seat, and drove east as the sky behind them went the color of old ash, carrying a plain envelope with a wedding ring inside it that he chose not to throw away without quite being able to explain why. Only that one day, the truth would have a longer memory than any forged signature, and would find its own way home. Spokane was not where Callum Reed had imagined rebuilding his life, but it was where the offer came. And in the months after Seattle, he had learned to treat practical certainty as a luxury he could no longer afford to reject. He hired on as a night shift maintenance technician at a cargo aviation facility, a job that paid $31 an hour and required coveralls and a flashlight and hours, inspecting hydraulic lines while the rest of the world slept. And he took it without complaint because it kept the lights on and left his days free to raise Wren, who was 8 and had her father's patience and her mother's perceptiveness and an adaptive resilience she had arrived with, mostly intact. He worked his shift, made her breakfast, walked her to school, slept 6 hours, picked her up, made dinner, helped with homework, and then, after she was in bed, sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and returned from first principles to the problem he had been paid to solve, and then had his payment revoked. He did not use the Sentinel Loop code because the intellectual property had been removed from his possession through documents he had not authorized, but he rebuilt the underlying algorithm entirely from scratch, working forward without reference to anything that had been taken from him. In a routine pre-flight inspection 14 months into this process, he identified a sensor calibration inconsistency that the aircraft's onboard diagnostics had cleared as within acceptable range, a discrepancy subtle enough to go undetected until the plane was at altitude with freight aboard, and flagged it to the carrier with full written methodology. The incident reached Naomi Vale, legal counsel for the carrier's insurer, who was direct in manner and precise in thought, and who told Callum after a 2-hour conversation that what he had described was a diagnostic capability most certified avionics systems did not perform, and that he should patent it before someone with more institutional resources noticed the same gap. Naomi connected him with an aerospace investor, and within 14 months, Callum had filed 3 patents, signed a licensing agreement, and incorporated Northstar Vector in a rented warehouse with 3 employees who worked on folding tables. The first 2 years were not a success story. They were a study in controlled persistence under financial conditions that would have ended a less technically certain operation before the end of the first fiscal year, because the major airlines declined meetings with a technician whose name still carried the shadow of the Aurelian dispute, and smaller regional carriers were cautious about staking their safety reputation on equipment from a warehouse in Spokane. Callum sold the house he had been renting to own, reduced his salary to a figure his accountant described as technically legal, and continued because the alternative was to let Grant Hollis be the final chapter, and he had decided in the specific and unsentimentally clear way he made decisions he intended to keep that Grant did not get to be the final chapter. A significant near-miss event at a regional carrier, one that Northstar's monitoring system had flagged 47 minutes before the aircraft's own diagnostics registered the anomaly, changed the industry's attention overnight, and the contracts that followed built the company in layers. Cargo carriers first, then commercial aviation, then private jets, and finally defense contracts that required security clearances and altered the scale of everything. By the time Wren was 19 and enrolled in aerospace engineering in California, Northstar Vector was valued at more than $8 billion, and Callum held the majority stake, yet he still lived in a modest house, drove a 4-year-old pickup truck, declined every media interview offered to him, and had not been back to Seattle in 11 years. Naomi, now his legal director and closest colleague, had told him more than once that living as though everything could still be taken away was not the same thing as being careful. Then she placed on his desk a financial analysis showing that Aurelian Aviation, after 2 quietly suppressed technical incidents, was approaching insolvency at a rate that made a controlling acquisition possible at less than half the company's stated value, and Callum Reed it, set it down, said he was not interested in going backward, and meant it entirely until he saw the name Sentinel Loop referenced in one of the incident summaries, at which point he picked the report back up and read it from the beginning, and 3 days later he signed the acquisition agreement with a single condition. His identity as the buyer would remain undisclosed until the first all-company meeting. Grant Hollis walked into the Aurelian boardroom on that Monday morning with the settled confidence of a man who had spent 11 years constructing a version of history favorable to himself, and had every reason to believe it would hold through one more introduction. He had been told only that a private equity group called Northstar Vector had acquired a majority position, that the new principal shareholder wished to address a formal board session, and that the acquisition terms included a transition period during which Grant would continue as chief executive under new oversight, an arrangement he had interpreted as evidence that whoever bought the company understood the value of keeping experienced leadership intact. Celeste had prepared welcoming remarks and stood near the head of the table in the practiced posture of a communications director, who understood that first impressions with new ownership were their own form of negotiation. Benedict Ashcroft, the board's longest-serving chairman, sat at the far end with the expression of a man who had survived corporate transitions before and considered this one manageable. When the door opened, Naomi Vale entered first, followed by Callum Reed in a dark suit, carrying a leather document case, and the unhurried composure he had always brought into rooms where people expected him to be less than he was. And the silence that followed was not the ordinary pause of introductions, but the specific silence of people recognizing something they were not prepared to process. Grant moved through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 4 seconds: recognition, disbelief, and the rapid reconstruction of a face, determining what options remained. Celeste's eyes went to the plain envelope Callum had placed on the table before taking his seat, and from its dimensions and weight, she understood exactly what was inside it. Callum stated that Northstar Vector held 67% of Aurelian's outstanding shares, and that he would be assuming the role of executive chairman with immediate effect, speaking in the technical language of systems and safety records without any reference to personal history, and the absence of grievance in his presentation was more disorienting to Grant than direct accusation would have been, because it offered nothing to push against. Grant attempted a practiced fraternity, invoking Callum's name in a shortened form, and suggesting that what had passed between them could be understood as the kind of misunderstanding competitive men in ambitious situations were prone to make. A framing Callum acknowledged with a single nod containing no agreement. Benedict proposed the immediate removal of both Grant and Celeste as the cleanest transition path. Callum declined and explained that removing the current leadership before a full records audit would create precisely the conditions under which critical documentation was most likely to disappear. Grant kept his title as acting chief executive, but was required to submit every decision above a defined threshold directly to Callum before execution, and Celeste retained her position as communications director with a first assignment, preparing a complete public disclosure covering every technical incident that had been classified as internally resolved without independent review. Callum locked administrative access to the core servers, retained an independent audit firm, and informed the more than 2,000 employees watching the internal broadcast that no frontline or manufacturing worker would face consequences for reporting problems, that management had previously discouraged them from reporting, a statement that produced a stillness on the factory floor that supervisors later described as the specific quiet of deciding whether to trust something they had not been offered before. When Grant characterized the morning's proceedings as a personal vendetta dressed as corporate governance, Callum replied only that if he had wanted personal revenge, he would have allowed Aurelian to reach insolvency on its own timeline, and that choosing to save it instead required considerably more patience than revenge would have. Celeste asked, quietly and away from the remaining board members, whether Callum would consider a private conversation. He told her he would, but not about their marriage, not about the years of silence, and that any conversation between them had to begin with a single question: who had used his credentials to authorize the transfer of Sentinel Loop's ownership? And when Celeste looked across the room toward Grant in response, Callum saw in the quality of that look, for the first time, not calculation but something considerably more basic than that, something that resembled fear. Callum gave the company 30 days, announced at a floor-level meeting, with every department represented, standing in front of the assembly line rather than behind a podium, and the 3 rules he laid out were precise. No data was to be deleted or relocated without logged authorization. No employee who reported an existing safety concern would face professional retaliation, and no product would proceed toward delivery until it had passed an independent technical review by engineers with no commercial relationship to the company. Grant responded by circulating a quiet message through the middle management tier, suggesting that the new owner's review was a precursor to eliminating several hundred positions, a rumor precisely targeted at the people Callum most needed to be honest with him. Callum countered by spending 3 consecutive evenings on the manufacturing floor, walking each department without a communications handler, asking technical questions in the specific vocabulary of a person who had built systems rather than managed the people who did, and listening to the answers with the attentiveness of someone for whom the technical content was the actual point. On the 4th day, a structural engineer named Delaney Pierce sent a meeting request marked as a personal matter, chose a conference room with no interior windows, and placed on the table a folder she told Callum she had been waiting for someone with the authority to receive. The folder contained her technical review of Apex guidance. The flight control system, Aurelian, had been developing toward a contract worth $1,400,000,000, and it described a code architecture whose structural patterns bore organizational and logical resemblances to methodologies she had been unable to trace to any Aurelian-developed module, resemblances she had noted in a formal report submitted 14 months earlier that had resulted in her demotion from senior verification to a contract position within 3 weeks. What the report described was a failure mode Callum recognized immediately. Under conditions where two sensors provided diverging readings beyond a defined threshold, Apex guidance would default to the sensor with the earlier calibration timestamp rather than averaging the inputs or flagging the discrepancy, meaning that a sensor drift gone undetected would be treated as the authoritative source of flight data, while the accurate sensor was ignored. Callum asked Delaney whether she had found real-world incident records matching the failure profile, and she produced 2, both classified internally as resolved anomalies, both involving Apex guidance-equipped aircraft, both exhibiting the specific oscillation pattern that would result from a system repeatedly correcting toward inaccurate data rather than flagging the conflict. Celeste was assigned to draft the public disclosure document covering those incidents and produced a first version written in language calibrated to suggest minor procedural irregularities rather than a systemic design defect. And Callum returned it with 3 paragraphs crossed out and a note that said the purpose of a safety disclosure was to communicate the nature of a risk rather than to manage perception of the company's response to it. Celeste told him that rewriting the document in those terms exposed her to scrutiny she had not agreed to accept. He replied, in the even tone he used for assessments he wanted to land without qualification, that her exposure had been established long before this assignment, and while it was not a kind thing to say, he said it without malice, and somehow that register was harder for her to argue against than anger would have been. Naomi pulled Callum aside that evening to report that Grant had been in contact with a financial journalist, that 3 of his personal accounts had initiated wire transfers consistent with an asset protection strategy, and that Delaney had forwarded something from the system access logs without commentary. And when Callum opened the attached file, he found a user account entry showing that his private data repository had been accessed remotely 3 weeks before the Sentinel Loop test failure, and the username on the access record was not Grant Hollis but Celeste. Callum met Celeste in the corner office that had once been his, the one Grant had kept with the drafting table still against the far wall, as though it were a trophy rather than a tool, and he stood near the window rather than behind the desk in a way that declined to claim territory that felt contested. She sat without being invited, and began in the tone of someone mapping the dimensions of their own culpability rather than explaining it away, telling him that Grant had come to her 8 months before the test failure with a request that appeared, in the framing he gave it, to be limited and specific. A copy of Callum's investor presentation for a financing contact who was comparing system architectures. Grant had spent many months convincing Celeste that Callum intended to dissolve the partnership and license the technology independently, leaving both of them with nothing, and had simultaneously ensured, through a parallel set of conversations that Celeste acknowledged required her own willingness to be persuaded, that Callum's absorption in the technical work was evidence of a marital detachment that would end the marriage regardless of any other factor. She had used Callum's credentials to access the repository herself, taken what she believed was a presentation deck, and forwarded it to Grant. 3 weeks later, after the test failure and the board investigation had given the transfer its institutional cover, she discovered that Grant had taken not a presentation but the full source code archive, the developmental documentation, and the entirety of the algorithmic framework Callum had built. Callum asked why she had said nothing when she understood the scope of what had happened, and she answered with the flatness that characterizes honesty that has nothing left to protect. She had already committed adultery, had already signed documents she now understood to be fraudulent, had already accepted equity in a company built on stolen work, and the only direction confession led was toward the dismantling of everything she had positioned herself to have. She had been afraid, and she had chosen the version of fear that kept her life intact, and she was not asking him to understand that choice, only to know that she had made it in full awareness of what it cost him. Callum told her that what had caused him the deepest damage was not the infidelity, which had eventually produced scar tissue, but the knowledge that she had watched a person she once trusted be categorized publicly as a fraud and a failure, and had chosen every single day for 11 years not to correct the record, and he said it without theatrics, and the absence of drama made it land with a precision that grief would not have achieved. Celeste then told him that Grant maintained a private archive in the restricted section of Aurelian's secondary hangar facility, physical documents, email records, and at least one audio recording of a conversation with Benedict Ashcroft, accessible only to Grant and Benedict through proprietary authorization, and that she believed the archive contained the original transfer documents and evidence that the ownership conversion filing had been executed with a fabricated signature. She asked Callum not to tell Wren about the extent of her involvement. He replied that Wren was old enough to be told the truth, but that Celeste herself would need to be the one to tell it. Before Callum could say more, Wren's name appeared on his phone screen, and when he answered, she asked him, in the direct and clear-eyed way she had always asked the questions that mattered, whether he was using the situation to settle a score or to fix something real, because those two things produced different versions of him, and she preferred the second one, and he told her he was trying to keep them separate, and she said she hoped he did. And the conversation ended there, without resolution, but with a clarity that stayed with him. The article appeared on a Tuesday morning, under a headline framing Callum Reed as a vindictive billionaire, using a corporate acquisition to wage a personal campaign against his former wife and business partner, written with an intimate familiarity with private correspondence that could only have come from someone who had supplied the source material directly. The emails reproduced in the piece were real but excised from the context that made them coherent. A message telling Grant to stop committing the project without authorization became evidence of controlling behavior. A note confirming a meeting time became evidence of obsessive communication. And the narrative assembled from these fragments characterized Callum's professional collapse as the product of psychological instability rather than corporate fraud, constructed by someone who had spent time in advance thinking through exactly which details to include and which to omit. Aurelian's share price dropped 9% by midday. 2 airline clients issued statements indicating they were monitoring the governance situation before proceeding with pending contracts, and a coalition of 4 board members formally requested that Callum recuse himself from operational decisions pending an independent governance review, a request framed in the language of institutional responsibility and functioning in practical terms as a mechanism to strip him of authority before the technical audit could reach a conclusion. Benedict Ashcroft arrived with a proposal he characterized as pragmatic. Callum would retain full ownership. Grant would continue as operating chief executive. The safety investigation would proceed through an internal committee, and the situation would be managed quietly in a manner protecting shareholder value. Callum listened to the full proposal, asked 2 clarifying questions about the committee's governance structure, determined that Grant would retain effective veto power over its findings, and declined. Naomi confirmed that evening that Grant had instructed a mid-level IT administrator to delete a folder of historical certification records, and that the administrator, a young man named Marcus who had attended one of Callum's floor meetings, had instead forwarded the deletion request to the compliance line Callum had established on his first day, and that Naomi had secured a complete copy before Grant's instruction was processed. She told Callum this with the particular satisfaction she reserved for situations where someone had underestimated the quality of preparation already in place. The scheduled certification flight for Apex Guidance was locked into the regulatory calendar 3 days out, and if the flight ran without a recorded incident, Grant could execute the contract and transfer technical liability to the purchasing entity before any ongoing investigation reached a formal resolution. If Callum canceled without documented technical justification, he handed Grant the narrative of deliberate sabotage by a controlling former partner willing to cost the company a billion-dollar contract to satisfy a personal grudge. In a meeting with Naomi and Delaney, Callum proposed converting the certification flight into a formally witnessed technical evaluation with an independent flight test crew, full real-time data access, and an onboard system specialist which transformed the exercise from a certification event into a monitored demonstration with independent observers. Grant responded publicly that if Callum genuinely believed the system was dangerous, he was welcome to board the aircraft himself. Callum said that he would, without hesitation, and Naomi told him afterward this was either very calm or very reckless, depending on how the next 72 hours resolved, and he told her it was neither, that certain failure modes, only present under real atmospheric conditions and actual altitude, and that watching a data feed from the ground was not the same as being present with the data when it mattered. Celeste discovered the night before the flight that Grant had already prepared a signed statement attributing any technical failure to unauthorized interference by Callum in his role as systems specialist aboard the aircraft, a document whose existence meant Grant had planned for the flight to fail in a specific way and had decided in advance who would absorb the consequences. And she sat with that knowledge for a long time before deciding what to do with it. Before the flight, Callum opened the desk drawer, found the plain envelope in the toolbox, held it for a moment, and placed it back without taking it aboard, going to the aircraft without it. The test aircraft lifted off from Aurelian's private evaluation field at 9:47 in the morning under clear conditions, carrying a minimum crew, a licensed flight test pilot named Harris, Delaney Pierce in the systems monitoring role, Callum in the technical observer position, and an independent data recorder whose certification had been verified by a third-party aviation body. Grant and a contingent of board members and technical representatives watched from the ground control facility, where the Apex Guidance telemetry was displayed across a wide monitoring array, and Grant's posture through the first 40 minutes of flight was the posture of a man watching a demonstration that was about to prove his critics wrong. Callum and Delaney monitored the system's decision log against raw sensor feeds in real time, not watching for the gross anomaly but for the small persistent one, and for the first 40 minutes the flight was technically unremarkable. The system performed within its stated parameters, the sensor inputs were consistent, and the Apex guidance responses logged cleanly across every standard maneuver Harris executed. Then Harris introduced the test condition. He adjusted the aircraft's orientation to create a slight but measurable divergence between two adjacent lateral sensors, simulating the kind of subtle instrumentation drift that could develop over a long flight without triggering an immediate diagnostic alert, and the Apex guidance system responded precisely as Delaney had predicted in the report Grant had buried 14 months earlier. It selected the reading from the sensor with the earlier calibration timestamp and began issuing a continuous sequence of micro-corrections to the flight surfaces, each small in isolation but persistent in aggregate, pushing the aircraft steadily off the heading Harris was maintaining manually. Harris disengaged the automated system, which produced an acknowledgement showing the system as inactive, and 31 seconds later, Apex guidance reactivated itself without crew authorization because a governance routine embedded in its architecture overrode manual disengagement unless a secondary confirmation sequence was completed, a sequence documented nowhere in the crew operating manual, and the aircraft began a slow, accumulating drift outside the boundaries of the designated test corridor. From the ground, Grant transmitted that the flight crew should maintain the test profile and continue collecting data for the full certification window, which required an additional 22 minutes of flight. Callum countermanded the instruction without elaboration, told Harris to treat the aircraft's safe return as the only current objective, and when Grant transmitted again at higher volume, Callum muted the ground channel, which produced in the control facility a reaction that observers described as Grant going very still in the way of someone calculating, rather than responding. Callum guided Delaney through a module isolation process, requiring them to remove the governance routine from the active processing stack without triggering a cascade shutdown, a procedure that took 11 minutes and 3 attempts because the routine had been written to resist standard removal protocols, a characteristic that was not an engineering artifact but an engineering decision. When the isolation completed, Harris took full manual control, stabilized the aircraft, and landed on the primary runway in conditions that were technically clean. No one was injured, and the complete data record was intact and unambiguous. Delaney, while Callum was still running post-landing diagnostics, found that the governance module's creation timestamp placed its origin inside the Sentinel Loop development window, but after the date Callum had submitted his final certified code version, it was an insertion into a system he had completed and signed off as finished, and the authorship metadata pointed to a user account Northstar's forensic team, confirmed within the hour as belonging to Grant Hollis. While the ground team's attention was absorbed by the aircraft's return, Celeste had used her executive credentials to enter the restricted archive of the secondary hangar facility, photograph the original transfer documents and the email chain from the period surrounding the test failure, and transferred a digital audio file to a secure drive. She was still in the archive when the door opened and Grant walked in and told her, in the quiet, precise voice he used when he wanted someone to understand the full weight of what he was saying, that if she handed over the material she was holding, she would lose her financial position, her standing, and any remaining possibility of a relationship with Wren, and Celeste, recognized the architecture of what he was saying, because that same structure built entirely from the fear of losing what she currently had been applied to every significant decision she had made for 11 years. And she looked at the drive in her hand and sent the complete contents to Naomi Vale's secure inbox before he finished his sentence. The emergency board session convened within 2 hours of the landing, driven by Grant's formal allegation that Callum had deliberately induced the flight anomaly and that the entire evaluation had been engineered to manufacture a crisis, providing institutional cover for personal retribution. Benedict Ashcroft called the session to order and framed the agenda as a governance question about whether an executive chairman who had actively undermined a certification process retained operational standing, and Grant sat at the table with the posture of a man who had prepared for exactly this room. Callum entered with Naomi on his left, Delaney on his right, and Celeste walking independently 2 steps behind, a configuration Grant immediately characterized as coercive. And before anyone else could respond to that characterization, Celeste stood at the table and addressed the room in the voice of someone who had been preparing for a specific kind of moment for a long time and had decided the preparation was finished. She confirmed that she had committed adultery with Grant Hollis during her marriage to Callum Reed. She confirmed that she had provided Callum's credentials to Grant at his request, and discovered afterward that the scope of what Grant had taken exceeded what she had authorized. She confirmed that she had signed fraudulent transfer documents and had been aware for more than 9 years that the ownership conversion had been executed through a fabricated authorization, and that she had remained silent because the personal cost of speaking had appeared greater than the personal cost of complicity. She stated she was not testifying under coercion, and requested her statement be entered into the record in full, and the room held a silence with texture to it. The silence of people recalibrating what they believed they knew about the institution they had been governing. Naomi presented the technical evidence. The forensic analysis placing the governance module's authorship in Grant's user account, the original transfer documents showing the fabricated signature, the email chain demonstrating Grant's possession of the source code during the test failure period, the certification records marked for deletion by Grant's direct instruction, and the audio recording in which Benedict Ashcroft told Grant 17 months earlier that the Apex guidance system was not certifiable in its current state, but that the contract timeline required proceeding regardless. Benedict said nothing when the recording played, and several board members left the room briefly and returned with the expressions of people who had been on the phone with attorneys. Grant made a final attempt to position Callum outside the rational frame of the proceedings, telling the room that it should understand what it meant, that a man who had lost his wife and company had spent a decade constructing the means to reclaim them. And Callum looked at him with the patience of someone who had been waiting for a question to be reduced to its actual shape, and said that Grant had never taken his ability, his capacity for the work, his relationship with Wren, or any portion of the future he had built from the lowest available starting point. Grant had taken only the things Callum had once believed were irreplaceable, and 11 years had produced an education about that belief that he considered valuable. He exercised his controlling shareholder authority to remove Grant from every executive role, to suspend Benedict pending regulatory outcome, to halt the Apex guidance contract and initiate a complete recall of deployed units pending independent recertification, and to retain an external forensic firm for a full audit of 12 years of technical and financial records. Grant was escorted from the building by facility security in a manner that was quiet and final, and Celeste resigned voluntarily and offered full cooperation before being asked to do either. The press statement Callum reviewed before its release described every technical and financial violation in plain, specific terms. The infidelity was not mentioned, and when Celeste asked him afterward why he had withheld it, he told her that the documented record of what Grant had done to aviation safety was sufficient punishment without requiring her private humiliation to become public record, and that his own pain was not a commodity he intended to distribute. As the room cleared, he reached into his document case, removed the plain envelope that had traveled from Seattle to Spokane to this boardroom over 11 years, and placed it in the labeled evidence box alongside the transfer documents and the audio recording, and closed the lid, and the ring that had once been a symbol of a life he believed in became in that gesture exactly what it now was: a piece of documentation in a matter that was formally and completely concluded. 12 months later, Grant Hollis entered a guilty plea on charges of corporate fraud, document falsification, and the deliberate suppression of safety-critical engineering data, and received a sentence of the kind that removes a person from the ordinary course of things for a period long enough to constitute a genuine consequence. Benedict Ashcroft negotiated a civil settlement requiring the forfeiture of his board positions and a financial restitution to shareholders that consumed the majority of the personal wealth he had spent 4 decades accumulating. Celeste avoided criminal prosecution through her voluntary testimony and early cooperation, but lost her equity position, her title, and the professional reputation she had built on a foundation that no longer held, and she relocated, took a communications role at a nonprofit organization, and began making structured quarterly transfers into a restitution account for the return of funds received through the fraudulent transfer agreement. She had a conversation with Wren that lasted 4 hours and covered the full account of what she had done and when she had known it, and the conversation ended without resolution, but also without permanent severance, the most honest outcome available given the information involved. And Callum offered Wren no guidance about how to respond, because the relationship between his daughter and her mother was not his to manage. Aurelian Aviation's operations were absorbed into Northstar Vector's production structure as a subsidiary division under a leadership team Callum assembled primarily from within the existing workforce, because the people who had built the company's products had not been responsible for the decisions that compromised them. Delaney Pierce was appointed Director of Systems Safety with a mandate explicitly protected from commercial pressure, and not a single manufacturing employee lost their position as a result of the leadership failures that had preceded the transition. The intellectual property rights to Sentinel Loop were formally restored to Callum through the legal process, and rather than commercializing the technology under exclusive terms, he transferred the rights into an independent research foundation mandated to advance open standard safety systems for commercial aviation, governed by a board composed primarily of practicing engineers. The foundation also established a legal support fund for engineers who reported safety concerns and faced retaliation, funded at a level Callum described as the cost of replacing the system that should have protected Delaney when she first submitted her report. Wren came home in December and found her father in the hangar with 2 senior engineers running a pre-deployment review on a new navigational prototype, and she stood in the doorway watching him for a moment before he heard her. She asked him, in the direct and unhurried way she had always asked the questions that mattered, whether becoming the employer of the two people who had destroyed his life had turned out to feel like winning. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved, and told her that the real victory had happened a long time ago. On any one of the mornings in Spokane when he had gotten up and gone to work, and kept her life stable in the period when he had been entirely certain that everything he had built had already been taken from him. That, he told her, was when he had found out what he was actually made of, and knowing that had been worth considerably more than anything that had happened in any boardroom. Naomi arrived with 2 cups of coffee and asked whether he intended to stay in the hangar until the building closed, or whether he could be persuaded to have dinner at a table that was not a workbench, and he said that he could, and something in the ease of that answer, its lack of qualification, its absence of the weight that had accompanied every simple decision for 11 years, was its own kind of evidence about where he had arrived. Before they left, he crossed the hangar to the drafting table that had traveled with him from another version of this life, and turned off the light above it. Outside on the runway, an aircraft running Northstar Vector's navigation systems lifted cleanly into the last of the evening light, and Callum watched it until it was gone, and then he walked out. He had walked into that boardroom with a wedding ring on the table and a single sentence about truth, and what he carried out of it was something neither the ring nor the sentence could have given him on their own, a life that was entirely and irreversibly his own.